joining us today, so thank you all for coming. We are pleased to have a number of events still to come, covering a wide range of topics, including science photographer Felice Frankel, who will be presenting her work on March 21st in connection with the Places and Spaces Mapping Science exhibit event, which is currently on view in the second floor of the library, Gallery 360, and International Village. If you had not had a chance to walk around and see it, please do, since it's only here through the end of March. We're also partnering with the Humanities Center's Artists and Practitioners and Residents program to bring marine toxicologist Susan Shaw to campus to give a talk about the Gulf oil spill. On April 11th, we'll be having author John Powers give a presentation on his book Fenway Park, A Salute to the Coolest, Cruelest, Longest-Running Baseball Stadium in America. For more information about the library and our upcoming events, take a look at the events page on our library's website, library.northeastern.edu. You can also like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter, which is @ClubSnow. We're also filming today's event, which will be made available on the library's YouTube and iTunes University channels. We'd like to give a special thanks to our co-sponsors for making today's event possible, the Northeastern Department of Philosophy and Religion, and the NU Bookstore as always. Books will be available for purchase after the event, and a book signing will follow. Also, thanks to the friends and supporters of the library. Information on how you can become a supporter of the library can be found on our sign-out table outside. We are pleased to have Lars Iyer with us today as a part of our Meet the Author series. Lars teaches philosophy at Newcastle University in England. He has written 2 books on Maurice Blend's show, and is also a contributor to Britain's leading literary website, Ready, Steady, Book. His last novel, Spurious, was widely acclaimed. The Guardian recommends the book for its insults alone. Lars is here today to talk about his new novel, Dogma, which brings back the bickering duo Lars and W. This time, they are embarking on a drunken lecture tour through the American South. Let's figure out what all this Dogma stuff is about, and please join me in welcoming Lars Iyer.
Thank you. Thank you all, thank you for coming today. And thank you to the university for hosting this, the library as well. And a wonderful poster, which is, or better, I think, than the cover of the book, which is lingering around the campus in various places. And the 2 novels feature the same characters. One character has my name, Lars, and you can infer from that that he has some relationship to me. The other character is called W. He's simply known by that initial. So Lars and W, as Kai was saying, Lars and W bicker a great deal. They argue a great deal, and W in particular takes exception to virtually everything about Lars. And in the novel, you'll find endless variety of tirades against Lars for all kinds of reasons. Now, both of them are would-be philosophers or philosophers. They're people who want to think, who try to think, but at the same time, for them, they feel they're unable to think. They don't measure up to the great European thinkers they admire. They're unable to speak with sufficient depth of scholarship and learning. They have insufficient political engagement. These characters have a very strong sense of their own inadequacy and worthlessness. But luckily they have their friendship. They take joy in their friendship. And I suppose many of the themes of the novel are quite dark, but I would think of it as a joyful novel, I hope, as a funny novel, I hope, as well, as a novel which is about friendship, about love, about coping in the face of adversity. The section I want to begin reading is actually set in my hometown of Newcastle, and it's set in a Victorian flat. A flat is a British word for apartment. This flat has a small bedroom, a tiny living room, and it's characterized by one thing in particular. It's incredibly damp. It has a fungal growth on all the walls, and indeed, later on in the novel, it's even infested with rats. So this is the setting of this part of the novel. And W has come up from his native town of Plymouth, which is down in the southwest of England. So W has come from Plymouth to visit Lars in Newcastle. I look ill, W says. Grey. What do you think is wrong with you? Is it the plaster dust continually falling from the ceiling? Is it the filth on the kitchen counter? or the cans of stale beer? Is it the fact that the whole flat is tilting sideways, like the deck of a ship in a storm? It's the yard, W's sure of it. The shore of concrete at the same level as the window, covered in algae. It's like the end of the world out there, W says. Dead plants, no more than sticks in pots. The long crack in the kitchen wall which lets in the rain. The mould-encrusted hopper overrunning with water. Then there's the damp, the omnipresent damp. It's no wonder that I cough constantly. Even he, W, has a cough, and he's only visiting for the weekend. He's staggering around like Widow Twankey. How can I do it to him? How can I do it to myself? Why is he drawn back to my flat again and again? Why does he want to see where it happens, or fails to happen? Ruination, W says. Living destruction. The Jews have a name for it, W says. The tohu vavohu. The chaos that preceded the act of creation. He supposes the Hindus have a name for it too, W says. Actually, he supposes Hinduism is a name for it. W in the character is Jewish, is a Catholic convert. Lars, by contrast, is a Danish-born Hindu. Curious mix, you know? You drink too much. That's your problem, W says. Mind you, I'd drink if I had your life. My instincts are wrong, W says. They always have been. How else can I account for the horror of my life, with its lurches and shudders? How else can I account for that desire for ruination that has marked every one of my relationships? It's going to end in a stabbing, W's always said. Someone's going to stab me. But if not him, then who? One of your nutters and weirdos, he says. I know enough of them. You've been stabbed before, haven't you? Nearly, I tell him. Well, next time they'll really get you. My God, your friends, W says, though we'd hardly call them friends. Outpatients. Case studies. What do you think they see in you? What do you see in them? I draw them to me, my nutters and weirdos. I can never get rid of them. You're too weak, too passive. I regard myself as an object to which things happen, W says. I call it fate. He called it idiocy. Is he one of them? One of my nutters and weirdos? It's his greatest fear, W says. W's decline is getting worse. He doesn't work at night anymore, but watches trash TV instead. And now, like me, he's downloaded Civilization 4. What appalls him, he says, is that he plays Civilization 4 with more seriousness than he works. Of course, W knew that the last thing he could ever do is to buy Civilization 4, which meant that he went straight out and bought Civilization 4, W says. Then he destroyed Civilization 4. He snapped the CD in two. Then the next morning he went out and bought it again, he says. But he threw the whole package in the bin before he even got home. Then, in a weak moment, despairing of his many years of intellectual work, and convinced he'd taken a fundamentally wrong turn in his philosophy, he downloaded Civilization 4 from a torrent site, W says. It has been playing it ever since. Having Leonard Nimoy as a narrator is an attraction, of course, W says. Whenever you discover a new technology in Civilization 4, It's Leonard Nimoy who speaks some apposite quotation. It's edifying, W says. He hears Leonard Nimoy's voice now whenever he reads philosophy, he says. This is my Leonard Nimoy impression. It's about to happen. It's necessary to know whether we are being duped by morality, W reads in Leonard Nimoy's voice. It is the nature of reason to perceive things under a certain species of eternity, W reads in Leonard Nimoy's voice. The great philosophers we've heard have always had unfeasibly high voices, we agree. Think of Heidegger on that CD W bought in Freiburg, going on about Hulglim. He sounded like a castrati, W says, and does an impression. Sein und Scheiße. Ich bin ein Scheißekopf. Then there was Levinas. Didn't W phone him once from a Paris phone booth? He was going to ask about attending the Talmudic reading classes. But he had to put the phone down when Levinas answered, W says. His voice was so high, the receiver fell from his hand, with Levinas saying, "Hello, hello," in his very high voice. You're not one of those happy fat men, are you? W says. He always thought being fat made you happy, he says, but I just look sulky. W is cheerful and full of bonhomie. Why shouldn't he be? The apocalypse is imminent. Things are coming to an end. But in the meantime, it's always the meantime in the pub, W says. There's always time enough when you're drinking. We stopped for another pint at the Tyne, and for another in the garden of the Free Trade, looking upriver to the city. W admires the view. Of course, he says, they'll put up some great building to spoil it. It's inevitable. Just as new flats are planned for the empty lot behind us. Flats for yuppies, W says. Flats for yuppies and preppies spawning like rats in pastel sweaters. But W is reassured when I take him through Byker Wall, the legendary Byker Wall, where the city planners tried to make a Scandinavia of Newcastle, building social housing in the Danish style. Scandinavian social democracy, W says in admiration. It's the one positive contribution your people have made to the world. It's a shame that my Danish genes triumph over my Indian ones, W says. It's a shame that umpteen generations of Danish trailer trash completely overrun the noble line of Brahmin priests. W sees my Danish relatives in his mind's eye. Blonde beasts in vests, W says, belching in the fjords. Alcohol ruins us, W says. Pubs ruin us. Ah, what he might have been had he never drunk. What he might have been if he hadn't discovered the bar in Essex University Student Union. Of course, once you reach a certain age, once you're old enough to look round at the world, there's nothing for you to do but drink, W says. Once you understand that you live in the age of shit, there's nothing else for you. W reminds me of the fragmentary conversation in Dostoevsky's Notebook. We drink because there is nothing to do. You lie, it's because there's no morality. Yes, and there is no morality because for a long time there has been nothing to do. We've nothing to do. Isn't that our problem, W wonders? There's no morality. Doesn't that describe our condition? We don't understand what it is to work. We don't understand what it means to be good. There's no grandeur to my thinking. There's no grandeur to my drinking. That's what he objects to, W says. Big distinction here. As we nurse our pints in the Cumberland. I should be falling off my bar stool like the drunks in the opening shot of Bellatar's Werkmaster Harmonies. In some important sense, I haven't followed through, W says. I'm not consistent. I'm hopeful, despite myself. I must have some instinct for self-preservation, W says. I must have something within me that holds me back from the abyss. What's my secret, W wonders? What sustains my existence from moment to moment, given that my certainty that life is shit should give me no such sustenance whatsoever? That's a section set in Newcastle, wandering the Usburn Valley from pub to pub, having conversations in a very relaxed way over pints, as we do back in Britain. I might pause here and ask if anyone has any questions or anything they might want to say, any comments or objections or fruit to throw, any of these things. Please, anyone got any questions or comments? Thank you, yeah.
I have a question. As a teacher of philosophy, do you find that fiction provides sort of a different vehicle for students to use when they...
I keep this book well away from students. I keep it well away. I don't think students either I teach would know about this book or indeed read it. I don't think it's an edifying and serious volume, and I would distinguish what I try and do when I teach philosophy completely from what I try and do when I write novels like this one. So when I teach, I want to impress upon the students the seriousness of philosophical thought and the loftiness of the great figures in the philosophical tradition. I want to get students to critically analyze arguments and work out their underlying logic and this kind of thing. And this is exactly the opposite of what's going on in the book Dogma. Any other, yeah.
Well, just to pick up on, so what is the motivation for writing an unedifying book?
You know, it's something which puzzles me enormously. Perhaps it's too much edification in an attempt to edify, at least, in another sphere of life. But in another sense, you know, one of the curious things that writing such as the writing I do, one of the peculiar things that it can accomplish is it can turn around a certain mood that you might find yourself in. So if you're frustrated at the state of the world, if you're angry at world politics, if you're puzzled why no one does anything about the big issues and why our political system seems to fail us so often, if you feel those kinds of frustration, not to mention frustration with the British university system, which is a whole other story. If you feel those kinds of frustration, one of the things that seems to happen as you begin to write about them is your mood lightens, and it begins to be funny, it begins to amuse you. You know, we're accustomed to the great philosophers of France, the existential philosophers of Sartre, Camus, and so on, and to the great Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, and to the Germans as well. And continental European style existentialism is something marked with an emphasis on anxiety, on moods of this kind, and moods of this kind are supposed to disclose the real state of the world to us, and indeed, in some way, to disclose us to ourselves, the self we've been hiding from. But in the UK, in Britain, this continental way of looking at life's problems is something we find it difficult to empathize with. We cope with these issues in the UK, in Britain. We cope with them by laughing. And this is one of the sources, I think, of British comedy. So one of the things you find in various strands of British comedy is laughing in the face of despair, or transmuting despair, the base material of despair, into the gold of comedy. And that is a tradition I would like to join. I'm not sure I have, and that's what I aspire to. But that's our response to these kinds of existential dramas. Can I ask if there are any questions or any other comments or anything else at all? Yeah, thank you.
Your title, Dogma, and your characters given their religious past, were you having some play with larger global issues that sort of we tend to be too dogmatic culturally now globally? Were you trying to tweak that a little bit?
Well, I guess I should have explained the larger story in the novel. The two characters in the first third of the novel undertake a tour of the southern states. They tour, just Tennessee actually, but they visit Nashville and they visit Memphis and they give talks there. One thing they notice is their talks are very poorly attended, and those who attend have no real interest in what W and Lars have to say. They decide to form a philosophical movement. And this movement will organize presentations in an entirely new way. And the idea is you connect with your audience through some kind of passion, through some kind of shared pathos, through emotion. I'm not sure if you've been to academic presentations, they can be pretty dry, and it can be very hard to work out exactly what's going on in them. The people presenting these papers can be fantastic scholars and academics, there's no question about that. But sometimes there can be an issue of communicating to an audience. So W and Lars give themselves a series of rules, and these are the so-called rules of dogma. And those rules are that when you talk philosophy, you're not allowed to use a single proper name. You're not allowed to refer to any particular philosopher, no one. When you try and present your ideas, you are not allowed to quote from any philosophical text. You have to address your audience directly, and your argument has got to stand on its own 2 feet. You can't appeal to any lofty kind of authority. So the idea they have is of directly reconnecting to the audience. Well, this is how they start, but as the novel proceeds, these presentations and the dogma rules become more wacky and more strange. And as the book progresses, there are 18 different presentations which I discuss. I think it must be about the 9th or the 10th. Rather than speaking, they simply write the word on the board, dereliction. And they sit in front of it, heads bowed. I think it must be the 11th presentation, which takes the form of a dance. The 12th presentation is a performance piece which involves coming to blows. The 13th presentation doesn't even occur in a university. It occurs in the great outdoors, with only W and Lars present, presenting to one another on a water taxi in Plymouth Harbour. The 14th presentation, and so on. So each presentation becomes more and more absurd, and dogma, which might have started for noble reasons, becomes a reflection of the character's, I'm not sure what word would do here, perhaps daftness, a reflection of the character's daftness. Any other questions or any other comments? Well, I'm going to risk bringing coals to Newcastle, as we say in England, anachronistically. I'd like to read a section of W and Lars's visit to Memphis. And I should explain, before I begin this section, that the characters have a fascination, not just with lofty figures of philosophy, but also with great literary figures. And one figure they fixate on, which is something that occurred particularly in Spurious, is the novelist Franz Kafka, who lived in the early part of the 20th century. And Kafka lived the life of a literary martyr. He barely published anything during his lifetime. It wasn't good enough for him. And in his final will, he bequeathed the writings that remained to his friend Max Brod, instructing Brod to burn these writings. Burn them, he said. They're worth nothing. Well, Max Brod, Kafka's friend, is someone now who is almost entirely known for being a friend of great men, Kafka included. Brod, after Kafka died, wrote a couple of biographies of Kafka. He wrote theatre plays based on Kafka's writings. And he did so in a way that did not impress literary establishment, the philosophical establishment. In fact, people found Brod a rather puzzling figure. The cultural theorist Walter Benjamin said, Brod is a question mark in the margins of Kafka's life, which sums it up wonderfully. As we read Brod, and Brod can be very crass and simplistic and silly and rather ponderous. As we read Brod, we ask ourselves, why did Kafka have a friend like Brod? Well, W is always wondering if he is Kafka or if he's Brod. He's always wondering whether he is the Kafka to my Brod, or whether I might be some strange Kafka and he's my Brod. But most often, W feels that we're both Brods and nothing other than Brods. So I refer to Max Brod and to Kafka in the passages that follow. Another name is Maurice Blanchot, and he's a literary critic and fiction writer, who both the characters revere for the integrity of his lifetime, integrity of his lifestyle, and for his obscure and difficult and fascinating literary writings. So we're now in Memphis. The word barbecue doesn't mean the same thing over here, says W over dinner. Nor does the word ribs. He's right. What have we been served? Vast oval plates of red-cooked meat. French fries in great piles. It's frightening. I must be in heaven with my enormous greed, W says. My life has peaked at this point, hasn't it? I've finally found a country where I don't feel perpetually starved to death. W has always liked chubby men, he says. We recall the fat singers we admire who drink wine out of bottles on stage. Fat, angry men. Is he angry because he's fat? I ask of the singer in Modest Mouse. No, he was angry and then he got fat, W says. Do you think he minds being fat? I ask. He has other issues, W says. Of course, Kafka was thin, W reminds me. Yes, but he was ill. Blanchot was thin too, says W. But he was ill as well. I bet Brod was fat. Definitely, I agree. He drank too much, that's why he got fat. Why do you think he drank? W asks. Because he knew he wasn't Kafka, I tell him. We watch a band on Beale Street, playing for tips. There are preppies everywhere, all around us. W hates them. What are we doing here, he says. Between songs, the singer comes round the crowd with a hat. People have to promote themselves in America. We've noticed that. They're not ashamed of it, as they would be back home. There's no welfare state. That's what does it, W says. But playing for preppies, it's the ultimate indignity, W says over our pints of big-ass beer. It's my birthday today, reads the sign on the windshield of the taxi carrying us home. We ask our driver to tell us about the old Beale Street, before it became a tourist trap. It was a rough place. People getting stabbed, Pee-wees, the Panama, the hole in the wall. They're long gone, he says. The gambling houses too, even the pool rooms. Beale Street was torn down after Dr. King was assassinated. They rebuilt it in the 80s for the tourists. He tells us about how he saw Howlin' Wolf play one of the bars of old Beale Street back in the 50s. Wolf would crawl around the stage on all fours howling, he says. That's how he got his name. And then, Wolf would get women to ride up on his back, and he'd go around the crowd. He had an extra long microphone cord, see? Sometimes he'd go out and sing in the street. He'd howl at the moon. He laughs. Is it really your birthday? W asks him. Every day is my birthday, he says. In the hotel bar, W muses on our lecture tour. It's not going well, is it? He says. It's going badly, I agree. Worse than ever. But why does it surprise us, W wonders. What did we expect? Some Kant-like resurgence late in life? Some late awakening from our dogmatic slumbers? Our presentations are too polite, he says. Too conventional. We should learn from Howlin' Wolf, he says. We need more pathos in our presentations. More fire. We need to howl at the moon. Isn't that what W has always hoped to hear in our presentations? My howling at the moon. The great cry of non-thinking. Isn't that what he's waiting for? But all I've ever managed is the mewling of the imbecile, W says. Ah, when will we learn to speak like real philosophers, W says. When will philosophy itself sing through our presentations? Philosophy itself. W imagines us like the Delphic Pythia, speaking for the oracle, interpreting what it said. He imagines us like the Aerophants of the Eleusinian mysteries, bringing our congregants into the presence of the holy. Philosophy itself would speak, W says, and we would interpret what it said for our audiences. Philosophy itself would sound through our presentations like the wind through a wind harp. He's too scholarly, W says, too concerned with footnotes and references and appeals to the great names of philosophy. And as for me, W shakes his head. What can he say? It's not simply that I'm unscholarly, that I haven't mastered the protocols, which of course I haven't. It's more than that, W says. I'm non-scholarly, where the non means much more than a simple negation. I'm a parody of the scholar, of course. I'm a grotesque double of the real philosopher, very true. But it's more than that. I pay no heed to philosophy whatsoever, W says. Reason, rigorous argument, none of it means anything to me. In its way, it's admirable, W says. But the effect on my audiences has been terrible. My booming, my near bellowing. W, as my co-presenter, has to sit beside me as I babble. W has to field questions for me and explain me to our fellow conference goers. Ostracism. That's what I brought him, W says. Derision. Every door that was open to him is now closed. The shutters have been slammed on the windows, and W's out in the cold, stamping his feet for warmth. And there I am beside him. What do I want from him? W asks. What does he want from himself? Ah, there's no way of telling. He'll simply have to follow where I lead and listen to what I say. We're heading out into the wilderness. He knows that. Out beneath the flashing stars and the silvery pines to where nothing can survive. So W has accepted his fate. Lars is the person who'll be leading him. Perhaps Lars is a secret Kafka and he, W, is only a Brod. But it's at this point the characters begin to devise the idea of dogma, which later on in the novel solidifies and becomes the movement that gives the novel its name. Once again, I'll pause and ask if there are any comments or objections or winces or anything you would like to ask me or to say. Go ahead, yeah, thank you.
So I'm a fellow philosopher, so I also worry about the poor job that philosophers often do in communicating with people. Well, presumably, given your description, you don't solve that problem in the book.
Well, I guess these characters are not the sort who can be trusted with such a mission, which is a very serious mission. So I think they give philosophy a pretty bad name and confuse and bewilder the audience. So, yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree that if we work in philosophy, we must do a better job of communicating, not just with our peers or with our students, not just with the university body as a whole, but with the public. And I've organised many events in Newcastle, which is a very deprived part of the UK. Many events which bring together philosophy staff members and various local groups, including school children and various interested parties. We're actually organising a festival of literature and philosophy later this month. So it's something with which I'm very concerned, but I hope I go about it in a altogether more serious and sober and less compromising way than the characters in my novel.
So do you have your own dogma rules about how to arrange this in a way that will be more successful?
I suppose, you know, the first few dogma rules in the novel, I think, are quite useful in any context. The idea that you present an argument then and there, and that argument has to speak for itself and be assessed on its own merits. When you present something, you'd say, this is my position, this is what I have to say, and invite discussion. And to do so, you know, pretty early on, I mean, give a 10-minute presentation, 10-minute talk, and then get the discussion going over 40 minutes, an hour, if not longer. So that's the first 2 or 3 dogma rules, I think, are eminently sensible if philosophy is to open up and engage a larger audience. Any other questions or reflections or musings? Thank you. Yeah.
Why did you base the character Lars on the man Lars?
Well, it's a question I often wonder. I suppose each of us have a dark side, and even though I might not do what the character does, there's something in the character's actions, the character's wacky relationship to his friend, which is in me and in my friendship with the real life W. So I suppose I wanted to foreground that and suggest that this was actually part of who I was in some sense. And I make a lot of fun with my own background and this flat in Newcastle in which I actually lived. You know, this was real. I had this terrible damp infestation, and I was punished for my hubris because I got the kitchen stripped out, I got the damp proofing put into the walls, I got the bathroom stripped out, the damp proofing was put into those walls too. I held a party to celebrate the end of the damp. In the kitchen, in the top right-hand corner, that night there was a tiny speck of moisture in that top left-hand corner. And the next day it was the size of a tennis ball. And the next day it was the size of a beach ball. It spread throughout the newly plastered walls. It compromised all the new stuff I bought for the kitchen. It spread throughout the kitchen and then began to spread into the living room. And meanwhile, things weren't good in the bathroom either. And then in the bedroom at the front of the property, damp suddenly appeared behind a cupboard as well. I was at this time courting my now wife. I'd like you to see her relatives here today. And you can imagine what a poor impression I made on Sinead when she visited Newcastle. Luckily, her family have a great deal of expertise when it comes to dealing with old properties. So I was given very good advice, and as a result, I was eventually able to sell the thing to investors.
Was that advice?
The advice was, get out of that flat. But you know, I was trying to persuade Sinead to consider making Newcastle her home and come over from Cork in Ireland to live with me. And we had a rat infestation. A rat infestation. Now, Spurious, the novel, there's a lot of stuff in there about the damp. There's a whole description of the damp and its impact on my life. Well, in Dogma, it's the rats. It's the second plague. So it's the rats who make life problematic and difficult and so on and so forth. Dogma's second part of a trilogy. And the third part of the trilogy will be out this time next year. And that book is called Exodus. And in Exodus, there's a plague of building works all around you. And this reflects my own experiences in my office. In my office in the department, I can hear on three sides of the building, demolition work, building work. And not only that, but they're actually gutting the corridor in which I work. The whole corridor being gutted. So it's an absolute racket at all times. And that is noise as the third plague in the third part of the trilogy. I suppose coming quite close to the close of today's session, are there any final questions or comments, anything else? Yeah.
Do you do your writing in that office on all the racket? Is that influence?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Instead of taking a lunch hour, I'm wandering around taking fresh air, that's the one. I stay in my room and I spend half an hour a day, or maybe an hour a day, just jotting down some notes and having some fun. A lot of it, these novels come from a blog I started many years ago, right when blogging was a new thing, about 10 years ago or so. So I kept this online journal. And the idea was to trick myself into doing some philosophical work. I thought, okay, if I write online, that will force me to try and make my arguments clearer and sharper, and it might make me write in a clearer manner since I'm writing for a general audience. It's a great idea. So off I went with my lofty ambitions. But what I tended to find is I was writing these skits. I was writing these dialogues which reflected some of the conversations which I had with my good friend W. Now W, as you'll see in the novel, W is always getting at me. He's always criticizing me. I shouldn't say me, should I? Criticizing Lars, the character is completely different from me. He's He's always criticising me. But you know, the curious thing is, the way in which the novels are written, Lars is very deadpan, and he doesn't really respond to W, not really. And it seems that he's very put upon, and very passive. But maybe the act of actually writing down what W says, his cruelties, his criticisms, but also his lofty and rather ridiculous aspirations, maybe writing them down is Lars's form of revenge, and indeed perhaps mine. Thanks everyone for coming along today, and well, there's copies of the novels for sale outside of the counter. I'd be delighted to talk to any of you or to sign a copy if that's something you wish. Thank you very much for listening to me today.